Hi everybody, can everybody hear me okay? I will try to project as best as possible. All right, thank you Cameron very much for inviting me to speak to you tonight, and thank you Sam for your help with prep. I'm going to talk a little bit today about a project I've been leading over the past 18 months or so to develop the first ever AI policy for the Zooniverse platform. So I'll start with a little bit of background on what exactly Zooniverse is for folks who are not familiar with the platform, what we do, how and why we identified the need for this policy. I'll talk a little bit about how we structured that process, some early results and things we've learned from this work, and the next steps that we still have to take. So I work at the Adler Planetarium. I'm going to talk a lot about Zooniverse. Zooniverse is a multi-institutional organization. I and my team are based at the Adler, and so I direct a team of web devs and a designer, but we also partner across several institutions to build and maintain this platform. So, quick show of hands, has anybody heard of Zooniverse before? Yay! That's great. Not required to understand the talk whatsoever. We are the world's largest platform for online crowdsourced research. And so this type of work is often called participatory research, or you may have heard it called citizen science. We tend to refer to ourselves as people-powered research, and we do this by providing a digital space for researchers to build and run projects, which invite volunteers, people with no expertise in the subject needed, to help them process their data to aid in research efforts. So the platform launched in 2009, and like I said, it's maintained by a team at the Adler in Oxford in the UK and at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And we work with hundreds of research teams around the world, and actually as of this morning, we can say we passed the 3 million registered volunteers mark. With some to spare. It was a really exciting milestone. And those, now more than 3 million volunteers have collectively produced, we're getting close to 1 billion classifications. So that's a milestone we're hoping to reach later in 2026. But that's dispersed across more than 500 projects that have been hosted on this platform now. So what's a project? The way that Zooniverse project works, in a very general sense, is that for each project on the platform, many volunteers will interact with a given data set. So this can be images, it's typically images, most frequently images. It can also be video or audio files, and we're currently working on building infrastructure for mapping projects and georeferencing coming later this year. So volunteers interact with data by engaging in a task or series of tasks depending on the project goals. And so these can be anything from answering questions about galaxies based on their visual morphological characteristics, as is the case for the very first Zooniverse project, called Galaxy Zoo, shown here, to tracing or coloring high-resolution electron microscoped images of cells to help scientists identify and segment the features that they want to study, as is the case for the Etch-a-Cell suite of projects, to transcribing or correcting automated transcriptions of historic texts, like English wills from the 16th and 17th centuries. That is English. Anybody want to take a pass? Probably not. And while projects are ongoing, research teams are expected to engage with their volunteer communities on project message boards. So answer questions, discuss the project, and offer assistance if people are running into problems. And then also communicate information about how the project is going, how close they are to completion, announcing new results or publications, keeping them connected to the work that they are contributing to. So once the data collection process is complete, the researchers carry out their data analysis and then share the results with the public. And this is actually a requirement of using the platform. You have to make your results publicly available within 2 years of your project's completion. And we set this requirement because we believe that volunteers should be able to have unrestricted access to the data that they helped to create. If you're asking the public to help you generate a data set, it isn't appropriate to then turn around and host it behind a paywall. And the main tool that supports this work is called the Project Builder, which is a browser-based tool that allows anyone to create and run a Zooniverse project for free. This is the Project Builder UI. It's fairly straightforward. You move through the little blue tabs on the left side of the screen, and the various pages allow you to do things like add content, build workflows, set up message boards, upload data, and export your results. To give you a bit of sense about the impact that the platform has had, to date, more than 450 peer-reviewed research articles have been published using data from Zooniverse projects. But the results have included everything from the discovery of new types of galaxies to helping the Oxford English Dictionary more accurately establish the date for when certain words began to be used, to helping designate new protective areas for endangered penguin species. So really broad range of disciplinary work happening, a really broad range of types of impact. So it's not just leading to academic publications, it is engaging with the broader world outside of academia, which I think is really important. So how do we get from this platform's existence to the need for an AI policy? In the past 3 to 4 years, we've started to see a shift in how our volunteer community responds to discussions and disclosures around use of machine learning in research projects. Sometimes it's referred to as machine learning. More frequently in the past 3 to 4 years, people are starting to use a more generic AI terminology. But machine learning has been used in Zooniverse projects for 15 years now, primarily in astrophysics or space science and ecology fields. But more recently, we're seeing it in history projects, biodiversity projects, a really broad range of disciplines. The earliest uses were simply taking data labeled by volunteers and using it to train models after a project is complete. There are publications from as early as 2011 demonstrating how Zooniverse data can be used to train models for effective data processing. But between 2011 and now, AI or machine learning use has significantly increased. So about a third of Zooniverse projects use some form of AI now. And traditionally, this has not been controversial. A subset of our volunteer community is actually really motivated to take part in projects because they're using machine learning. The people are interested in the science, or they see it as a confirmation that their effort is being used as efficiently as possible. But public opinion and practice are shifting. Researchers are increasingly using blanket terms like AI more and more, even if they really just mean machine learning. And that's interesting because the concepts, both of these concepts, AI and machine learning, were introduced in the 50s, and now there's a tendency for people to use them interchangeably, even though there are significant differences in what they are. So AI is the umbrella term describing computers that can emulate human thought, resulting in actions that take place as a result of those choices. Machine learning is a subset of AI and refers to specific algorithmic tools and techniques that are applied to solve tasks like pattern recognition or decision making. I will perpetuate the problem and probably use them relatively interchangeably tonight. But I think vocabulary is a big part of the shift that we are seeing. And so I wanted to, really acknowledge that part of the problem too. Sorry that this diagram is kind of complicated, but machine learning is not just for post facto training anymore, as demonstrated by this diagram, which is from a recent special issue of Citizen Science Theory of Practice, which was partially edited by my colleague Lucy Fortson. So there are now much more complex models for incorporating machine processing into online participatory research via a human-in-the-loop or machine-in-the-loop classification model. So, for example, you might start with volunteer-labeled data to train a model and then ask volunteers to review and edit the model's labels, which are then used to fine-tune the model to increase quality of results or accuracy. Or you may use a machine model to pre-sort the data that goes into your project, so your volunteers are more likely to engage with data that is relevant to your research goals. It's not just this after-the-fact thing anymore, is really the point that I'm trying to make with this graph. And so basically, as the technology matures, the ways that people are using AI on Zooniverse are becoming much more varied. So don't worry about reading this. Please don't panic. We are seeing these rapidly maturing methods as well as a spike in use of technologies across the platform. But until now, there has been no standard practice or requirement specifically for AI use on Zooniverse. We just expect general alignment with platform policies during our review process. And that includes the requirement that project teams need to disclose their research goals and methods to volunteers. All of the examples on this page are from real active Zooniverse projects. You don't have to read them in full, but I'll just say they include varying levels of detail, of technical description of how these projects are using AI, as well as a variety of information about safeguards that may or may not have been built into the processes that they're using. So this first example up top, very generic. Your contributions will improve machine learning tools. True. The second example in this bottom corner has some really good general detail. Machine learning methods have been effective in classifying glitches. However, we require training data to build these. So we're getting a little bit more specific in terms of why we're doing this. The third example shows a team getting into the weeds around not only the type of tools they're using, they're specifically talking about Amazon Textract, but they're also talking about the safeguarding measures that are in place. They're specifically saying that the data you put into this project won't be used to retrain Amazon models. I'm not critiquing any of these examples specifically, but I'm sharing them to give you a sense of the broad way that people have been communicating their research practices and methods around AI. All of these examples are also pulled from slightly different places in their project, whether it's the About page, the FAQ, the home page. So there's not like a single place that I, as a volunteer, would be able to go in a project to find their specific project AI approaches. On the other hand, some teams have been ahead of the curve in their transparency and have prepared statements on responsible AI use. So the example on the left is from a team that I worked with as an internal reviewer. And because they were doing research focused on literature and genre and fiction specifically, there were some volunteers that were really concerned that they were potentially going to use the data from their project to train AI to write fiction. And so the team addressed that specifically in this document, which details where their data and models will be shared and discloses that they will never use their data to create commercial products. The example on the right is something that a team prepared actually without any input from our team at all. They just did it on their own. But it's incredibly detailed and well thought out, and it even includes a description of how volunteers can request that their specific contributions not be used to train AI, if that is their preference. So it gives that opt-out choice. Ultimately, the tipping point for starting the work that I'm going to talk about tonight is the fact that we're starting to get more and more questions from volunteers around the specificity of AI use on the platform, and a growing amount of concern where previously our community hadn't expressed skepticism or wariness about this kind of technology. I will note this started happening around 2023, and I don't think it's a coincidence that this shift in public opinion on our platform coincided with the growth and awareness of generative AI technologies like ChatGPT and the way that people feel inundated with AI in every element of their lives. So we realized that public opinion has clearly shifted to a point where we needed to set up some expectations, not only around how to incorporate these methods into Zooniverse projects responsibly and ethically, but how to communicate them to the public with the right level of detail. So, with that in mind, I will talk a little bit about how we approached this process. Bear with me, this slide looks crazy, I know, but I promise it makes sense. So we applied for and received funding from the Copley Foundation to carry out this work. And we structured our information gathering process around a series of 4 virtual workshops. And we invited a variety of subject matter experts, computer scientists, ethicists, members of our Zooniverse leadership team, and Zooniverse project leads and volunteers for a series of virtual conversations around AI and participatory research. We had representatives from other participatory research platforms and projects as well. Even though the policy is specific to Zooniverse, we wanted that broader input from the field. And so we identified 4 main workshop themes. We have transparency and communication best practices. We have ethical approaches to machine learning and AI, so thinking about foundational elements of an ethical approach to this kind of public engaged research, which incorporates AI methods. Deepening contextual understanding, which expands on that idea of ethical approaches to consider the complicating factors of ethics, like disciplinary differences, task differences, and varying or sometimes even conflicting needs of stakeholders like researchers and volunteers. And then the final topic was downstream data protection. So thinking about licensing frameworks to use with research data outputs that take into account concerns raised through the incorporation of AI into our projects. And as part of this project process, because we have such a large volunteer community and limited space in the actual workshops, we sent out surveys to our full community of, at the time, not quite 3 million people before each workshop, and then we used those survey responses to shape the discussions that we had during the workshops so that that broader perspective was also represented in the virtual group. After each workshop, we synthesized the information that had come out of those discussions into key points, and then we shared them back with workshop participants so they could feedback and confirm whether they felt like their perspective was accurately represented in what we were pulling out of those conversations. So this diagram shows that multi-stage workflow where we're getting input before the workshop, during the workshop, after the workshop, and then all of that information together was used to shape and inform the recommendations that we drafted. And this process was really illuminating. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the survey responses and what we learned from that process. One example is that the awareness of when Zooniverse projects are using AI is not at all consistent among volunteers. So only 15% of survey respondents said they felt like they always knew when a project was incorporating AI. 43% said sometimes, and 20% said never, which is not ideal. We also learned that while people have a variety of concerns about AI, their primary concern was data quality and integrity. We know that Zooniverse volunteers are extremely motivated by the fact that they're contributing to real research, and so it makes sense that they are justifiably concerned that introducing automation into a process that had previously been carried out by humans may have an adverse impact on the project results. We, as members of the Zooniverse team, know that many studies produced with data from our platform have actually shown that a combination of human and machine classification tends to result in higher quality outputs than either alone. So the secondary information we can take from this is that we need to do a better job communicating those studies and sharing those results among our community members. We learned from the survey that volunteers who identified as being not okay with AI also tended to self-ID as people who dabble in one or a few projects, whereas people who identified as being dedicated to a project, meaning repeat participation over time, tended to be more comfortable with AI use. So we're potentially seeing some correlation to time and development of trust in the research team and familiarity with the work that they're doing. And then the final example I'll share from the surveys is that we learned there were trends in specific subject disciplines. So we cater to a lot of different disciplines on the platform, and we wanted our recommendations to really take that into consideration. What is an appropriate recommendation for one team is not going to be an appropriate recommendation for another. And in our surveys, we actually saw that people who identified as primarily participating in certain disciplines were more comfortable with AI use than others. So people who primarily participated in history or nature projects identified as being less comfortable with AI than folks who said that they most frequently participated in physics or space science projects. This could be for a number of reasons, including familiarity with the technology, since as I said earlier in the talk, physics and space science projects have been incorporating AI for much longer than history projects. And respondents who participate primarily in nature projects may be more likely to have concerns about environmental impact of technologies. Those are speculative, that's not coming from survey data, but these are some of the things we're trying to take into consideration as we make these recommendations. Okay. So our workshops finished in October of 2025, and in the months since, we have drafted a set of recommendations, including steps that we as an internal team can take, such as adopting standard ways of describing AI use within our platform, so creating a shared vocabulary or typology, and creating a dedicated page on our website to host information and resources related to AI use on Zooniverse, such as the recommendations that we are working on. The recommendations will also have specific recommendations for project teams, which include things like being specific about when, where, how, and why AI is being used in their project, and also considering the unintended consequences of incorporating this technology. So, for example, something we hear pretty frequently from teams who want to incorporate machine learning or AI into their project is that they want to offload the easy tasks to AI so that volunteers can focus on the harder tasks. But they forget that frequently those easy tasks are how volunteers onboard to the project and how they build up their knowledge and their skills to be able to complete those harder tasks confidently. So if you automate those easy tasks away, you've created a system without that opportunity for skill development, and that may result in a degraded user experience or even end up being a barrier to participation entirely. So we are currently in the process of alpha testing those draft recommendations with a handful of project teams right now. And then we're refining those recommendations based on the feedback we get from those teams. Unfortunately, because we're still in flux, I'm not going to share the full draft tonight. I'm happy to talk about examples, but they will launch at the end of June, so you don't have very long to wait. We'll launch our new resources and recommendations page on the platform. And we'll also implement the internal processes we've identified as part of developing these recommendations. So we'll be adapting a lot of our internal project review process to make sure that we are setting people up for success to be able to follow the recommendations we are asking them to follow. We're also currently writing up our process and results for submission to a peer-reviewed journal so that we can share this process more broadly with the wider research community. We think it has the potential to be really impactful even outside of participatory research spaces. And then over the course of the year after launch, we will continue to gather feedback from our community about these recommendations and our implementation, and we'll have a period of annual review. So we're building in opportunities for iteration and accountability on our end, rather than just having it be like a one and done response to a problem that will absolutely shift over time and continue to change and develop. Okay, last slide. We also haven't solved everything that we set out to solve, perhaps unsurprisingly when you get into work with ethics. These recommendations will be a really solid first step, but there are really big questions that remain outstanding for our platform and across the research field. And again, they're not just unique to participatory research. In terms of data licensing and open data, AI has changed the conversation. The scale of web scraping means that everything is fair game and can be monetized or used for purposes that do not align with the stated goals of a particular project or which don't align with our platform policies. Current data licensing structures fall short of providing meaningful protections or accountability measures because they rely on individuals acting in good faith for the benefit of the commons. We are not ready to make a recommendation that people stop believing in open data. And I think a lot of people perhaps would agree with that. But that, I mean, I think saying that accountability is hard does not absolve you from being part of that conversation and trying to figure out a way forward. And then similarly, when it comes to environmental concerns, we don't yet have good methods for gathering meaningful data around the environmental impact of a specific project or platform. There's a part of that conversation that feels a little bit akin to paper straws. We want people to be responsible for their actions and their contributions to environmental impact, but we don't want to focus too much on individual responsibility within relatively small research projects, lest we ignore the larger problems being caused by major corporations and the proliferation of data centers. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that if this work doesn't exist in a vacuum, and even if we aren't actively contributing to the negative impacts of AI technology, we are benefiting from its existence and the funding it is receiving. So we can't really opt out of that broader cultural conversation. Like I said, when you get into ethics, you can't expect any easy answers. So as I see it, the way we move ahead in all three of these topics is to continue to be in conversation with our peers, with our wider community, with other platforms, with the people using this technology. And the workshop series really drove that home for me. And many of the folks who took part also said that it really helped them rethink and refine their own thoughts around AI and its place in research, and how to justify that need in a time of legitimate criticism. So I'm really excited to launch these recommendations in a few months and see what sort of response we get, including those that are critical. As I said before, this is a first step, but definitely not our last one. Okay. Thanks. I'm going to stay up here.
Yeah. Folks, feel free to ask questions instead.
Yeah.
Hey, I have a couple questions. I think the biggest one is, are you planning, you mentioned sort of the conflation of machine learning and AI more generally. Going forward with the policy, do you plan to differentiate between different kinds of AI, for example, singling out generative AI or LLMs in comparison to image recognition or other forms?
Yeah, definitely. I think we're trying to create conditions. So when I talked about this like who, what, when, where, why approach, we're thinking about it from the perspective of like, if I'm a volunteer on a project, how do I find out how this use of technology impacts my experience in that space? Some people are going to be super jazzed to learn about like convolutional neural networks or like other really specific types of things we use. And we want people to include that. We also want them to include the like, this workflow uses AI and this one doesn't. So people can really clearly see, if I want to participate in this project, but I'm not feeling it, that's where I should go, rather than just leaving entirely. So we're trying to bake in levels of communication. But a lot of teams are already doing that. Like a lot of people, I think, go too far in that direction. And there's definitely a subset of people who are like super jazzed about reading about that. But we got to find that balance. Thanks. Yeah.
Could you go back to the disciplines?
Oh, sure.
Across disciplines. So that's a very interesting slide. Okay and not okay is not particularly nuanced.
No. It's really not.
And so, are you planning on expanding that, and especially in light of the last question? You know, LLMs versus machine learning, and I have a lot of problems with LLMs, but machine learning, I think, is in general a good thing. So
yeah, I feel like you're a plant because that's perfectly sets me to answer this. One of the things we identified that I didn't have a chance to include was the need for more formal opportunities to gather opinion and feedback from our participants and like actually get into the weeds about where those comfort levels fall. These were informal surveys. And so the next step would be to like work with external partners who do social science research to like really formally dig into some of the survey responses. And we've got a colleague at the University of Minnesota who's really interested in doing that work. So that's another thing as we launch part of that initial annual review, hopefully will include looking at the results. So another broader survey of our team.
So, and about the one follow-up about this slide in general, the lower percentages these represent the percentage of projects.
No, well, it correlates, but the framing of the question was asking people to identify what type of projects, like self-ID of what type of projects they participate in. And then this is like pulling out data across a couple of different survey questions around the people who said this and who identified as not being okay with any AI use versus being okay in certain conditions.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I do not understand this slide.
That's okay.
So what does it mean with medicine? Because we have okay and not okay around the same. So then most people that don't know. So then, is that what is that there's a third data set? I'm not even.
Yeah, and this is like it's just pulling out across, and it's like a very like informal results.
No,
but like, what are you?
No, like so. What is the difference here between medicine and?
Fewer people identified as participating in medicine and science projects, and many more people said, I primarily participate in nature or biology.
Gotcha. Okay, I know.
No, it's totally fine. Yeah, it's not. There's not. I mean, it's not. That's not. That's not.
No.
That's not your fault.
Can I just go for that?
Yeah, go for it.
Just to go that.
Yeah.
There's 64%. 61%.
Oh. Of the people who said that they were not. Sorry, I'm thinking about this. I have to pull my data back. 64% of respondents, so you could pick multiple projects. 64% of respondents said that they participated in nature projects. 61 said they also participated in nature projects, but they were not okay. Yeah. This is giving me good intel for future presentations around better labeling of my slides. Thank you.
And for projects in the nature category, what is the kind of trend for like policies around environmental impact of their machines?
I'm not sure I would be able to answer that. That's not my disciplinary specialty. One thing I do know is that they have a lot more disciplinary expectations around protective sharing of data. So thinking about a lot of projects in that nature category are going to be like camera trap projects where they're identifying wildlife species, and so they're not going to include all of that data in their publication if there's an endangered species and they want to protect or they want to lower the potential for people to use that data for poaching, for example. Sorry, I think you've had your hand up for a while.
Hi, thank you for giving the presentation. Wondering if there's a set number of people that access Zooniverse that meet in person, or these groups mostly in person, or are they across all these different institutions? And how many of these groups meet in person?
So when you talk about groups, do you mean volunteers? Do you mean people who are creating projects, or do you mean the people who run the platform?
I'm not sure how much of it is people in a room working on something.
I think probably, yeah. I mean, I know for our team, like, we are hybrid at the Adler, so we see each other on a weekly basis, but we also work from home. Our colleagues in Minnesota, I think, are not frequently. Volunteers, it's primarily an individual distributed volunteer network around the world, but I know, for example, when we used to have like Adler After Dark, sometimes we would have Zooniverse volunteers from Chicago show up and say hi and chat. But that was not like a formal meetup. If people are doing
in person based on geographic area,
perhaps. I mean, we're not necessarily like, we certainly don't control that, and so people may well be doing it. We just don't know. But yeah, interesting question. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. No, it's you. Sorry, I can't read your name tag.
So you mentioned like one of the big issues that I think we all have data like licensing integrity, or worried that like their volunteer data will be used, scraped for profit or. When you mentioned like staying in conversation with that, do you imagine like amending the open data policy in any way, or is that just really?
I can't answer that for the platform. The thing that I can say with certainty is that we heard from our survey respondents that they were concerned about primarily for-profit use of open data, but they were also very committed to open data for research. And people can hold conflicting opinions. We understand that that is something that humans are capable of. But it's one of the reasons we want to continue to be in conversation with what are other people doing. We've had some chats with the Creative Commons folks who are running the CC signals, the new licensing frameworks. They're interested in finding people to test that out. So we're talking to them about whether they can be in contact with project teams and see how that goes.
I don't know what they're saying. Some kind of GPL change in license.
Right. Yeah. So that's definitely what we mean by being in conversation there.
I have two questions.
Okay.
One of the things I was wondering is if you guys have seen either there's been any positive or negative relation between the rise in like attention on AI and whether that's affected y'all's funding or even participation in the platform. The other thing I was wondering is maybe if this policy probably doesn't extend this, so maybe personal curiosity, if there's been talk around what usage of AI in helping to build and maintain the platform itself.
Good question.
Either one of those.
I can answer them both. They're pretty straightforward. I mean, in terms of funding, of all the changes in the funding landscape in the past handful of years, support for doing work on AI is not at risk of losing funding. Of all of the things that are losing risk of funding, AI is not one of them. And I will leave it at that. In terms of how our team is using AI, I think people are experimenting with it on an individual basis. I'm part of the AI Governance Council at the Adler. So we have these sort of institutional policies. Like Oxford has one, Minnesota has one, and so because our team is distributed, we sort of are beholden to institutional policy. But I will say that all three of those are nonprofit institutions with limited resources. So you have access to what you have access to. Good question. Thank you. Oh,
yeah.
Sorry.
You mentioned just kind of in passing, poachers, using the trail data incorrectly results. Is there policies, protections, forethought into making sure that the work is not being used, incorrectly or for unethical reasons?
You mean beyond that specific example of the nature data?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the pieces that we are encouraging people to do as part of these recommendations. So, you may think, I'm trying to think of an example that's not, so there are actually geographic data is just a really good example, because there may be a project that is looking at, ways to identify flooded roadways. But in the wrong hands, that could be used by, I won't say governments specifically, but in the wrong hands, it could be used by people who are looking to cut off access to goods or supplies for communities. That would certainly not be the goal of the researchers running a crowdsourcing research project, but when we think about the scale with which data can now be ingested and applied, we just have to think about stuff that we didn't have to think about 10 years ago in that sense. And so that's part of what these recommendations are setting people up to do, is say, you have a responsibility as the steward of this data to think broadly about unintended consequences of producing this data set. Yeah. Sorry, could you repeat that? It's hard to hear. Mm-hmm.
Do everyone define the purpose of the project?
Can you repeat the question for the live?
Yeah, I will. So I think the question was, do all of the volunteers know the end purpose of every project, or is it sort of siloed? That is a great question. There's a lot of overlap between that and these recommendations, because there are a range of ways that people are complicit with our platform policies. So we can say you need to release your data. A data release can look like a lot of different things. It could be dumping a raw data file somewhere and saying, here's the data. It can be saying, here's aggregate, cleaned up, analyzed data with a data paper to go with it. It can be data embedded in a scientific paper. In terms of that follow through, I think that's something that by setting these recommendations, we are hoping that by implementing this for AI engaged projects, it's going to also help with a culture shift around just reinforcing the need for that follow through and that accountability. Good question. Yeah.
Two quick things. So you're requiring that people who use Zooniverse to get data for classified data release whatever they have to finish. Is there like a legal team you have for people who don't do that, or is it that hasn't really been a problem?
It hasn't got to that point. I will say, I think Oxford is the institution that holds our legal responsibilities, so I will not speak for them. But I do think that's something that has come up in a lot of this downstream data protection conversation. even when we're talking to, folks who are proposing new methods, the question is always, and what if they don't do it? Like, what if there's a violation of this policy? What happens? Whose responsibility is it? And what can they do? You feel there's like a David and Goliath thing happening all over the place, right? Like, somebody can throw money at a problem and make it go away, but that's not a reason not to try to do something, right? It feels really daunting, but I think that's where being in conversation with the broader community makes it feel less so. I don't know if you had a second question.
Just a second brief question. Sorry.
Sure,
So you mentioned around a third of projects are currently somewhat involved in the AI term. Is that? Do you know what that looks like over time? Like, has it always been around a third? Has it increased from what it did?
It's definitely increased. I couldn't tell you. I mean, that was like a team did a specific study and found that, and we don't have like ample studies to be able to compare.
I was curious. So you mentioned that the team would be publishing results, and I'm really curious about this sort of learning side of things. How are you hoping people use this? I think I asked this in the comments. Like, I see that there's like learning going in all directions here, so participants, researchers. I'm also curious, do you see any private examples of companies? Are they exploring any of these? It'd be great if there's this level of engagement around some of these product rollouts that I'm receiving on all these products. And so I'm sort of curious, like, the social learning value of the project and how you envision that.
I mean, if I could, nail a copy of the paper to like every city, I mean, I think there has to be a motivation and a desire to change, and if that exists, I would love to be in conversation with it. I cannot off the top of my head think of examples. That doesn't mean they don't exist. If anybody knows of any and wants to share, I would love to hear that too. I think that's a great question. But I know that one of our goals is to be a model for this type of work, even outside of our own spaces. Flaws and all, I think more people need to be willing to say, hi, we're doing this ethics work, it's really hard because there's no black and white answer, and so we're going to be vulnerable and talk about how difficult it is and talk about how it's messy and, share graphs that people have very good questions about. Walking the walk, talking the talk. But there is a vulnerability there that I think is not always something in industry in particular people are willing to open themselves up to. So it's very much motivated by hope, at least for me. Yeah.
There is someone of the team is in touch with the open source initiative because the open source initiative.
Yeah.
Because less than 2 years ago they published the definition of open source.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Are you in touch with that? There's someone that is a member?
Right.
Yeah.
So no, we don't have any. Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think it ties into, like one of the recommendations we're thinking about is around publication of models and sort of reminding people that when you publish a model, that is part of your results in your data publication. And one of the things we're not forcing people to use a specific type of publication, but I think having things like the open source initiative AI model in that resources space of like, here are some examples about things people are doing is definitely on our radar. That's a really good example of like something to point to so people can just see what else is happening in their field. Yeah.
Do you anticipate that your policy is going to include ethical guidelines?
Oh yeah, I mean that's very much like ethical guidelines, as in the types of stuff that we're including. Sorry, it has to be so big. I can't just like put it up on the slide deck because it's gonna change. But like ultimately the point is being made that you are responsible for your actions in the space, and so you need to do the legwork of considering potential risk, as well as thinking about optimization of your effort. Is that potential risk worth what you're going to gain through that optimization? I think a big part of ethics for this process is what we owe to the people who are participating in our platform, and how to ensure that we are putting standards in place where they have access to information, but they also know what questions they are allowed to ask. Because I think a lot of people have a lot of questions, but they don't necessarily know enough about the systems to be able to actually say, what licensing are you using? Like, how are you protecting against this? And so part of the ethics work, or part of what we see as the ethics work in these recommendations, is also giving people access to that information if they want it. Because not everybody, that's the other thing we learned from the survey, is not everybody cares. Some people are just like, I just like counting penguins, and I don't really care if people are using AI. Our volunteer community is not a monolith, so we have to remind ourselves of that. Yes.
There's a question from the live stream. Some asking on behalf of someone, but I'm curious if you have a gauge on, in addition to the survey or besides the survey, how much citizen scientists, volunteers are using AI, and if they use their use of AI inflates the number of contributions that they make on the platform.
That's such a good question. I didn't share it in the slides, but we actually did ask in one of our surveys, have you ever used AI to do a task? And it was 2% said yes. But people are not sort of blanket opposed. They're really concerned. Again, it's like a data quality thing. I think the nuance that we could pull out of that is that people weren't adverse to it if the conditions were appropriate, but there was a free text entry option on the survey, and we got some really interesting feedback around if machines are producing the first pass and then people are using machines to review the machines, then what's the point of any of it, and are you just going to produce slop? And it's well, yeah, that's a great question. But it was thank you for asking, person on the live stream. I was really struck by that when we saw that in the survey responses. Yeah.
I guess just kind of off of that question, it seemed like it kind of asked the question of the definition of AI, right? Apply to a wide variety of things. We asked them if they use AI to accomplish tasks, probably not because they're classifying galaxies, in their spare time. Right? But I don't know how many volunteers would have what kind of association.
And we had. Yeah, that's a great question. We did have some people talk about specific methods. The people that said yes were yeah, I have used ChatGPT Google to look something up.
And I'm assuming other projects are pretty.
But also somebody using Google could technically say they're using AI now too by default, right? Unless they're opting out of that search result. So again, this back to Steve and Jen, and I don't know your name, but the really great questions around the kinds of information we're getting from the survey. That's definitely one of the reasons that we would really like to do more structured work and again, work with people who have vested interest and more resources and expertise to have that be the forefront of the work rather than a subset of a bigger project, and actually allow that to be the focus. I think that's going to be really important as we move forward. Great question. Yeah. Great question. So for folks on the stream, asking for examples of how projects are using AI, and then examples of, are there any projects where volunteers are like asked or required to use AI? So I'll answer the second question first, which is no. There haven't been projects that are requiring. We don't have anything baked into the platform, so you'd have to go somewhere else to engage with a model. There's nothing directly embedded into our platform. And in terms of how people are using AI, some of the most interesting examples that I can think of are in the OCR world, for example, optical character recognition world. There are projects that are transcribing documents, both historical and modern, that are pre-scanning images of text to find specific pages that are likely to contain the stuff that they're specifically looking for. So there's a project at University of Minnesota called Mapping Prejudice that is looking at deeds to homes and looking at racial covenants that are baked into those deeds and mapping where those exist and how they're what those communities look like today. And so part of their process is there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of images, and only a few pages of a legal document is going to contain the text that they're actually looking for. And so when they rather than have people look through 100 images, 90 of which aren't going to contain this relevant bit and 10 which are, they're using that essentially to narrow the field. They know the results aren't good enough with the quality of documents that they have. A lot of these are from the 1960s. So they can't just transcribe straight from the OCR, but it's good enough to be able to predict the pages with relative confidence, these contain the kind of language that you're looking for. So that's one example. And then I think another example is trying to think of a different kind of example. There are some really interesting space projects which are putting forward potential candidates for the type of feature that they're looking for, whether it's images or looking at light curves. And they're again sort of saying I think these are something that you may want to review, and then people are able to look at and help. And so that's more of that human in the loop. They're able to refine those detectors based on what the humans are reviewing and then continuing from there. There have been some really fascinating projects that use AI. There was a team, maybe in Brussels or possibly the Netherlands, that basically was having people classify images of the human eye, and they were able to develop a way through having this amount of data at scale to do early detection of diabetes through that work, which I think is fascinating and transformative. And so we know that there are cases where this can be extremely impactful, and we know there are cases where somebody's messing around and it's just let's use AI, and hasn't really gotten through, especially as the field changes. I'm not talking about any specific projects that are just messing around, but I think just sort of generally the shift in the culture has been very much why not just use AI? And so this is part of our way of addressing that culture shift more broadly. Really good questions. Yeah, Sam.
A good chunk of people who come to Hack Night are new grads or students, either undergrad or graduate students, who are looking to get into lanes of work similar to yours. What's your background and how did you get into this work?
I have a Ph.D. in medieval musicology, so clearly now I work at a planetarium. I come from digital humanities as a subset of the field. When I was doing my graduate and my master's and my Ph.D., there were just starting to be certificate programs in DH, so I very much came from the learning by doing school. And when I started with Zooniverse, it was as a postdoc where I was basically leading a project to like, let's try and build more humanities tools on the Zooniverse platform. And that was 9 years ago now. So that's how I got into this specific field. But it definitely, I had come out of my degree with a deep appreciation for the topic that I was studying, and but I always really enjoyed multidisciplinary work, and so that has served me really well in my field. So.
All right, I think we're at time. Thank you so much, Sam.
And feel free to reach out. And if you mention Shy Hack Night, I'll get the ticket, and we'll be happy to chat more